Why, hello. Welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you here for this episode. We got Tom back after a week away. He was not well last week when we interviewed Rosario. But anyway, I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor. I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest. I've written a number of things, including The Household and the War for the Cosmos, and I'm a senior editor at Touchstone Magazine. Okay, let's go to you, Tom.
I'm Tom Price. I am back. Was so sorry to miss the last episode, but I am also very happy to not be in bed ill with whatever sick, disgusting thing that was going around. But I teach theology, philosophy, ethics, and one of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary.
Okay, Glenn, we'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, and I'm Glenn Sunshine. I am a retired history professor, senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, ministry associate at Reflections Ministries, these days in charge of curriculum development and doing some content. And I have my own 501c3 called Every Square Inch Ministries.
Great. We're joined today by a friend, Timon. Timon, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you and what you do?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, guys. I'm a longtime listener. Most of the time, frequently, but irregularly. My name is Timon Cline. I'm the editor-in-chief at American Reformer, which is a publication. We're going into our third year that's focused on the revival, I guess you could say, of serious Protestant social and political commentary. That's conceived pretty broadly. We publish a lot of stuff, but it is a space for Protestants to get back in the game, as it were. And I'm sure we'll kind of talk about some of that today. So that's my main hat. My other hat is I'm the director of scholarly initiatives for something called the Hale Institute, that is part of New St. Andrews College. Also a newer foundation. I run that with Jeff Schaefer, who's the director, and it's focused on developing curriculum, producing content, putting on events. We're working on rolling out several different educational programs, and I teach at NSA a little bit now. But the focus of the Hale Institute, taking its name from Matthew Hale, is to revive. There's kind of been this trend for Protestants to get back into talking about things like natural law. But this is to develop and revive, the common law tradition, jurisprudence generally, and good, solid, Protestant articulation of those things again, like we used to. So much, kind of ressourcement work involved in that, but also trying to analyze current legal issues and put that stuff into practice also. So those are the two main hats. Before I started doing this stuff, I guess last year full time, I always wrote things on the side, kind of moonlighting in that way, as I think Jonathan Lehman put it one time in one of his pieces. But the moonlighting as some kind of writer. But I practiced law for a couple years with the Attorney General's office in New Jersey. I also still have an affiliation with Westminster Theological Seminary. We're at the Craig Center there as a fellow and working on some historical projects with them. So, but I'm a well, I hate saying recovering lawyer. That's always like the joke. It's kind of like being a Marine, like you can't get out of it. You're just in, or the mafia is probably better. It was in New Jersey. So anyways, that's a bit about me and what I'm up to these days.
Well, yeah, I think the background of law is really relevant considering our topic and the things you do. But our topic today is political theology. And we just want to take it wherever you want to go, Timon. But I think maybe a good place to begin is with the canard that, Christians shouldn't be involved in politics, and that political theology almost sounds like a contradiction in terms. Don't we want people to, follow their heart and only, obey Jesus if they feel like it and stuff like that?
Right, of course. And it should be, you should be maximally free to express that however you want. Part of what I find interesting about that, and that's, that sentiment, I mean, you're obviously, it's appropriate for you, Chris. You're painting it in a cartoonish manner. But it's funny because it's accurate at its root. And something I think I was surprised, I grew up in the SBC, broadly evangelical circles. And I kind of thought when I became a Presbyterian, I guess 8 years ago now, that these are like the theologically serious people. I mean, I was at Westminster and I was going into OPC, so you won't find any of this garbage. Well, it turns out it's like everybody thinks this way as a default. If they haven't worked against it, this is kind of how they think about political life. And that was curious to me, because even people who are high on their confessionalism, doctrinal fidelity, all those things, you get to certain articles of the confession in its original form. I don't recognize the abominations that were added afterwards or removed. But you all of a sudden, and people get really uncomfortable. What do you do about this magistrate thing? What do you do about public morality? What's this restriction from the state, encroaching upon, these freedoms? Shouldn't we operate on a sort of million harm principle? As long as no legs are broken or pockets picked, we should be good to go. So something I do spend a lot of time on now is both in the recovery of, I think, what are better arguments or better conceptions of political life generally, at the most basic level. Just how do we live together? What's our way of life? How do we adjudicate these things with one another? And the appropriate moral and even religious role of government, right? Which used to be commonplace to recognize. And, later you get into many issues of prudence and all these sorts of things. But the baseline has to be a positive, conception or vision of society, and how government is supposed to actively form that as power given from God. And this is very uncomfortable for evangelicals, I find, most of the time, although providentially there are things coming to the fore currently in our country that I think are opening people up to reconsidering, maybe certain laxity in certain moral areas at least was not the best idea. So people are becoming more receptive, at least in a limited sense. But I do spend a lot of time trying to reintroduce people to, and a lot of times under-articulated ideas about authority and society that the magisterial reformers and their 17th century progeny, the codifiers of our faith in many ways, they just assumed and held, but didn't mean they didn't think about it. It was not an uncritical reception of some medieval scholasticism or whatever you want to say about that. They actually did spend time thinking about it, but there's many assumptions in there that we've lost, and it makes it difficult for us to kind of engage with that material sometimes. So I try to work on some of that.
Well, you mentioned something that is an assumption that we've adopted that's completely antithetical to the Christian faith, and that's the kind of utilitarian harm principle that we associate with Mill.
Yeah,
I remember who was it? The guy Ralph Reed. You remember him with the Christian Coalition back in the day?
Oh, yeah.
This dates me a little bit. You were probably 3 years old.
I've read about it. I don't remember him. I've read about it.
Well, I remember one time he was on television or something, and he used the harm principle and said, "This is probably the best articulation of the way a democracy ought to function." And I thought, "Are you nuts? What's underlying that whole outlook?" Well, it's not the Christian faith for sure. It's something that's been informed by a whole sort of materialist project. But anyway, so that's just one example. But another thought that occurs to me is that so often, sort of the salt of the earth, people who are in our pews, who think that things are commonsensical, and are continually surprised by the latest absurdity that comes from the left. They don't really understand how thoroughly their outlook was shaped by the Christian faith in terms of the ethos of the West. And now that that's gone and that the elites have turned against it, now we're seeing a whole new thing, and people are wondering what happened. And this is one of the places where they're not ready to go many times, but hopefully with American Reformer and your work, we'll get back there. But
yes, single-handedly we will lead evangelicalism back to a proper understanding of the social order. One point that always strikes me, I mentioned, the revival with Protestants of interest in natural law, probably over the past decade or so. Maybe I can't remember when Grable's book came out, but early 2000s. Which I see as an extension of some of the work, Richard Muller and those guys started several decades ago, and you're kind of getting to more and more material. It's translated, all that. One thing that I'm not a presuppositionalist, and I'm not a Vantillian. I did the reading I had to, and I moved on. But one thing that is kind of in a similar vein to what something some of my presuppositionalist friends would say is actually something I remember reading in Jonathan Edwards. In his miscellanies, I can't remember the name now. The number now. I wrote about it, but he was commenting that a lot of these things with natural law, with your reason, which everyone agrees has to be trained, right? It's not. There is a sense in which you have the natural intuitions, instincts, and so on and so forth. Even to religion, and we can get to that, but it does have to be trained. Althusius, John Owen, they all say this. There has to be ways that mainly the scripture, the traditions of the church, and good laws tell you, direct your conscience, direct your thought. And Edwards is just commenting at one point that, we've all grown up and been conditioned by Christendom. This is the mid-18th century. It's not clear to me, meaning Edwards, that this is replicable elsewhere that's not been conditioned by Christendom. And I think there's a lot to that, and we're seeing kind of the end of that argument being played out and maybe validated. But in a strange way, because of the, what's been implanted in us, the harm principle is not actually fully operational even among secular people, because you will see them grappling with this idea that there's something to what they would call a psychological health. I mean, that's now, in fact, becoming a driving force. Now, it's ill-conceived. It's a sort of bastardized form, but it means that they recognize material is not all there is to it, which, maybe can be another opening for Christians to reassert some of these arguments to them. But, I'm fairly pessimistic on some of that. But I think all of that is the cultural conditions that used to be taken for granted. We're now seeing, how disastrous that was to not maintain or insert kind of mechanisms of maintenance on those things. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the things we've seen erode in the West, of course, is the rich and robust understanding of the doctrine of creation and its teleological character, its orientation towards certain ends, and of course that coupled with the formative dimensions of creation, that it unfolds in accord with the way things are created and intended to be, and divine providence governs that, and those things established by providence are part of the formative dimension that brings this about. And so, for example, 17th century, you had an erosion of final causes happen through the philosophical, basically secular philosophy. So Edwards would have been up against this. He would have been confronting this probably head on and noticing what it could look like should this Christian assumption about reality erode. But then it basically, it was taken for granted in Christendom, if you will, that divine providence, even of bad political communities, served a purpose in terms of final causes of a certain kind of earthly perfecting of the created order. This is gone by the time 17th, 18th, 19th century. So a lot of the way in which the church basically nestles into those philosophical shifts, often without even realizing it, becomes the taken for granted assumption. And so therefore Christians think that these kinds of, the focus on political community is basically supporting this notion that individuals have their own purposes and ends, and the state is here to basically make sure that everyone can achieve that in a protected, safe way. That isn't anything like the classic Christian vision. So my point is that Christians have so absorbed so many of the assumptions that you're exactly right. Without the kind of rich ressourcement work and the deep commitment, not simply to, because I do agree with Rich Muller and getting a hold of those classic sources, but they have to be read in light of also classic theological doctrine that took a long time to carve out. And even if the Reformation gives it, I think, a full and right twist, I think some people have even read the Reformation through a doctrine of creation that is less than fully Christian and ended up with some of these tendencies.
Yeah, I agree with you, Tom. One of the things that disturbs me is sometimes people approach divine law strictly in a positive law sense, and that there's almost a kind of de facto ideology that it develops that is remarkably similar to the approach that Marxists or fascists would take, that we are imposing form on the formless, as opposed to recognizing given things and their forms and working with them. And anyway, but that's a whole other argument. But
no, I think that's. But I think it matters. I mean, you see what you could call, sort of a unifying pathology across certain domains for evangelicals in this sense. And it's no one, as Tom was saying, taking our not realizing how much the culture you're not attending to is actually forming you as you don't, subtly, like the frog in, boiling water. It's no coincidence in my mind. I don't know if it's causal, but it's not coincidental that at the very same time the court, the Holmes Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes Court, is castigating the natural order and natural law and the brooding omnipresence in the sky and so on and so forth. You have Protestants joining Barth in rejecting natural law and natural theology wholesale. That's all happening within the same basic time frame. Massive departure from American Protestant traditions, and then, of course, the extension, to our English continental roots, of course. But that it's all being eroded at the same time with the emergence of a more scientific approach to all these disciplines, right? Which is intentionally cutting you off from any kind of classic antiquity or traditions there. So that, that's all happening. And at the same time, you see this same kind of pathology, like I was saying, influencing hermeneutics and your approach to biblical theology, as it stood at the time. And then, once the culture starts encroaching too fast upon you, making you uncomfortable, then conservatives generally want to figure out how to respond. So you come up with basically firefighting fire. You come up with a positivist, aka originalist, conservative jurisprudence that's supposed to stop it. But it's so textually limited, with no background metaphysics or anthropology or anything that's supposed to inform law, that it has proven itself to be completely feeble and inept, as demonstrated by the Bostock case. I think that's the sort of everyone agreed. This movement, as was understood in jurisprudence, has just met its end. If it can't stop an act as recent as the 1960s from importing and anachronistically imposing a certain definition of human beings onto the language the people writing it never would have understood, then this is just completely bunk and it can't save us. And that was a positivist movement to I have no doubt that Antonin Scalia himself believed in a concept of natural law. How well formed, I'm not sure, but he, had these arbitrary limits on the judge's role and his ability to, understand the things you're judging about, which is people. And we do this in legislation and everything else. And I think it's connected to the complete secularization of the governing offices of magistrates. They have no concern for the complete human being, only as material conditions.
All right.
Another direction on this, this is a bit of a tangent, but I'll pull it back in. I was having a rather long-running discussion on Facebook with a woman in India, and she was arguing simultaneously that Christianity is okay in India, but conversion to Christianity is bad. And her argument was that being a Hindu is an artificial term. It's a term actually created by the British to describe a whole conglomeration of Indian religions. There's no such thing as a Hindu religion, to an Indian. There are specific religions, but Hinduism doesn't really work. She said that being Indian is being Hindu. That's all there is to it. And so these conversion things, which she always said were malicious and so on, just can't happen. And the reason why I'm bringing that up is that there are scholars of religion who argue that the very concept of religion as we think of it is a product of Christianity. Mm-hmm. That in virtually all other cultures, religion and society are religion and culture, religion and society, whatever you want to say, are so tightly integrated that you can't really separate religion out the way we tend to do it. And I would argue that this goes back to a de facto separation of church and state that becomes evident when Constantine legalizes Christianity. Christianity's functioned as an illegal religion for 300 years. That shows that it's separate from the state. That process gets accelerated post-Reformation, actually, into the idea of a completely secular state, something that is completely separate from any kind of religious underpinning. I mean, even if you look at Martin Luther with his two kingdoms theology, which is very different from the R2K stuff we get now, he said that God has two kingdoms in this world. Pardon me?
I was going to say it if you didn't.
Yeah. He says God has two kingdoms in this world. The right-hand kingdom is the church. The left-hand kingdom is the state. Both of them are here to promote God's will, God's purposes, righteousness, goodness, holiness, truth. They just do it by different means, and they have different types of jurisdiction. I mean, Calvin, similarly, government is based on covenant. All of these things. After that, starting with the sort of pre-Enlightenment, maybe early Enlightenment guys, where you start getting a radical secularization coming in, where government is seen as being completely separate in principle from religion. And then that accelerates further. The evangelicals with the kind of individualistic, voluntaristic approach to the faith. I think all of those dynamics are what lead you to the situation where Christians don't really have a clue too often on what to do with government, or even whether or not they ought to participate.
Yeah, it's interesting, Glenn. One of my teachers during my my post-grad years was Nicholas Lash, who was retired. Well, he was retiring at the term I had him. He was the Norris House professor at Cambridge University. He wrote a beautiful book called The Beginning and End of Religion. And he actually grew up in India. His father was in the military there, and he ends up converting to Catholicism. But he ends up recognizing that the whole notion of religion used in the West has no continuity, even with the way in which Christianity used the term religion up until about the 17th century. So those whole polarities, he starts to basically pull out a history and where these things start to take shape. Our whole notion of religion as basically this quartered off arena, if you will, in which can be severable from our political commitments and the like is really a byproduct of those shifts in philosophies and ideas that don't owe allegiance to. If you notice that, you can easily see it with early Reformation. What do you get? True and false religion. You don't get the religious sphere. There is no secular. Secular is a space of time. It isn't a cornered off. It's time. It's not space, right? There is no space it doesn't have to do with the dispositions of our heart and the orientations of our loves. And so you don't have a separation of church and state. It doesn't even make sense.
Yeah. So, Timon, so here's the situation we find ourselves in. We're at a place in time where, there's a paucity of really good contemporary work. We're trying to bring back, some awareness about what, our, forefathers in the faith, passed on to us. In terms of your work, I think we know you're all about trying to get us talking about this stuff. But if we were to think about, say, a world in which the situation has changed and we're moving forward in a way that you'd like to see us move forward, what does that look like? Do you have some thoughts about what do churches do? What do pastors do? What do institutions do? That kind of stuff. I know that's a very broad question. Take it wherever you want.
Yeah, I mean, many people will say this, including Aquinas says it. I mean, Montesquieu says it. Whatever your laws, and I would include in that your government, your polity, your structure, do need to be respectful of the condition of the people, which includes their history. So these kinds of proposals for America that you see out of certain circles that are completely foreign on all those fronts, are not feasible nor wise. But I think what you can work with is what has been native to the country until not all that long ago, historically speaking. One of those one of our real experiments. I hate talking about America as an experiment because I like living in countries, not labs. But one thing we really did try to work on is through our federalist structure to have a certain kind of religious diversity, meaning Protestant diversity, basically, that would be regionally or in terms of states carved up. Essentially, we can live this way, but we're going to at a certain jurisdictional level leave this to soft or stronger establishments, as the case may be. So I think we do have in our and federalism is again becoming very, very important for not necessarily religious, although I would say it's connected to that, but many political reasons now. I mean, you already see self-sorting and a sort of pre-Balkanization and regionalization already. So all of a sudden, federalism, especially post-Dobbs and now with immigration and I would say, broadly speaking, family and sexual issues, federalism is looking much more attractive to people again, where you might be able to and might indeed have to create a way of life that's very different from your neighbors, and that's okay. We have something that might be able to handle that. So I think that has to be included as, but the main thing I always like to emphasize, especially, is the background kind of history and conditioning of, what we call our founding, which stretches a couple hundred years prior to that, and to really understand, there's a big difference. From the university student today reading John Locke than if you're a 17th century Protestant reading John Locke. Very different perspective and assumptions, and even discretion and discrimination. I mean, 18th century Protestants are able to handle a little bit of Thomas Paine, and then they discard the rest of him, right, for various reasons. So trying to understand what we have through a truly historical perspective that tries to understand, what was actually created for us, and to the extent possible, recover those elements that are good and that are that are kind of still available to us. But I have no kind of fantasies about a full caricatured kind of return to anything. We have to move forward, and we have to be prudent with a lot of it may be our fault, but this is where we're at now. So now what do you do? So I think, beyond just the intellectual sphere, which I've been talking about, I want to see people doing that. I want our discussions to be better and more historically informed and faithful to our own tradition. And to some extent, pastors can do that in their teaching. Although I'm not one that wants to see political sermons every week. I think there's a place for that in our tradition, but not. It is very good for 1 in 7 days to think of higher things for once. So I don't want that, and that a lot of people think that's what you're talking about, is this sort of mass politicization of the church. I also am not a real subscriber, though, to the separation doctrine either, as some of my friends would be. I think there's problems there as well, because our thought needs to be of an integrated and holistic vision of society, which includes all of its elements, and not a carved up one. I think it's interesting. Again, this is not a causal claim, that as we've carved up society increasingly, we've started to carve up the human person also. So the bodies are corresponding in that way. And we also
it's a fascinating observation there, Tim, because in antiquity, the correlation between the human body and the body politic was pretty tight.
Indeed. Yeah, exactly. I think these things just there's more going on behind the scenes in the world, as Christians know, than meets the eye, and I think these things happen in a corresponding way to some extent. The national or political spirit, we might say, is going to be reflected in the body of the people, whatever's going on. So all that to say, I would like us to think in more holistic terms, including what the human person is. A lot of this is very, very bad or poor, sloppy anthropology that Christians run around with. And it was just very conventional for Reformed people to think of, if a governor is a king, a magistrate is over people, it's the whole person. That includes their soul. Unless, Richard Hooker would say you're governing hogs, then it's the whole person you have to consider. Now, this does not mean that you have juridical competency to do everything for them, but it does mean that you should certainly, as someone with power, support those organs in society that do more directly have that concern, which is why you would then say the magistrate is to be a nursing father and mother of the church, right? It's to promote them to be able to take care of the person in this way. So I think all that to say, we need to think better about it, but churches should also, in a sense, be more assertive in this way, because they are, and I'm thinking, socially and politically most often. I don't care as much about conversions when I'm thinking about this stuff. It's not interesting to me whether there is revival. I know exactly where I would have been in the 18th century, which is the curmudgeon old side, and then like this is nuts. I'm just not. I don't depend on these things. But when we're just talking about social public morality, you do need the influence of the church, its prophetic witness there to all people, and it should be privileged in a certain regard by the authorities. And you should be preaching morality to the public, even as on Sundays, of course, you're still preaching salvation and all these things as well. But it needs to see itself as a public organ or a public presence, rather than this retreatist kind of pilgrim sojourner thing that's just bandied about to really beat evangelicals over the head until they're just completely neutered and have no real influence in society at all. But we need to see this as part of the job of the church, and in turn we need to demand that our governing authorities treat us as such and respect us in this way, because a real and true commonwealth deserving of the name has to be oriented towards God. Otherwise it is a corpse.
So here's a thought. So you're at the Hale Institute. So this is an institution that is affiliated, of course, with New St. Andrews, but it has kind of an agenda and a purpose of its own, distinct from New St. Andrews. There's obviously an affinity there.
Yes.
I think about the fact that most of our colleges and the consortium of Christian colleges and universities, I think that's the title of it these days, don't seem to have much of an interest in doing what you're describing. In fact, if there's an institution of a higher education out there that, apart from, say, New St. Andrews, that comes to mind when this subject comes up, it's Hillsdale. I mean, and Hillsdale is not a part of that organization at all. In fact, for a while, people wouldn't have even called it a Christian school, although under Arnn, I think it's becoming more and more explicitly so. But in an interesting way, in the sense that it's, I think that they see Christendom as absolutely essential to the health of Western civilization. And you can't separate the two. Yes. And so they've kind of come in the back door, you could say. It's not because, they were set up by Billy Graham or something, or whoever, who was the founding father of the institution. But it's kind of that approach. Do you have any thoughts on institutions and their role, somewhat distinct from, but connected to the church?
Yeah, so colleges are obviously, especially, there's something about America where we've used colleges in many ways to, and I wrote something on this recently, but I'm going to assume no one's read it because that's usually the case, so this won't be redundant. But because there's much debate over this, of course, right? In America, the extent to which there is a class system or an aristocracy, right? Tocqueville talks about this. In fact, he says lawyers fill that role, which I'm okay with, because they have a sort of shared language and an ability to do certain things that no one else can at the time. So that's one theory, but the probably the more viable one too is that we have used universities and schools to filter these things and designate the people who belong to certain classes. Now, this has been somewhat muddied because with the massive expansion, whatever you want to say, if it's post-GI Bill, I don't know, but massive expansion of available institutions. But this is what we use schooling for, and that's why we're obsessed with education, especially middle-class people, the ones that want to keep moving. So it's a central aspect of our society, not just because we care about education itself, but because it has a social function. And I think it's important for Christian institutions in particular to recognize this and to start acting accordingly, which of course includes pursuing excellence and the truth and, whatever you want to call it, great books, this type of stuff, these aspects of civilization. You got to be like Denzel Washington in Book of Eli or whatever, like you're trying to protect them, assuming everything turns to ash and you're eating the hairless cats or whatever he's hunting that movie. Anyway, but at the same time, you need to, while everything still stands, and we do have many opportunities available to us still, I think, if we are serious about our society, we have to recognize it's necessary to produce elites that are not only of the character we desire, but also serve our interests. And I'm not saying that in a purely cynical way. I'm just saying that's how it works. And so we need to start thinking of our educational institute. And my point is, I think to some extent, Hillsdale has a bit of that mentality. It knows what it's trying to produce, and it is assertive, and it is outward facing. This is how the elite schools that now hate us act. They set the terms of debate and of the game. They control the lexicon, and they use those things to maintain their status, right? The problem is we can't be quite as ruthless or dishonest as those people, but we can take a bit from their playbook and say, really, our educational institutions are about conveying status to the people we want to be in charge. And this is how we've done it in America, and we need to get back, kind of on the ball with thinking that way. It's a long-term project, but I think that's what schools often do.
So what do we do with the insecurity of our institutions? I mean, I think that,
yes.
that if I think about, say, your typical school in the Christian world, so let's just pick on some names like Wheaton or Gordon or whatever. Mm-hmm. I don't think self-confident. I don't think assertive. Mm-hmm. I think adaptive and insecure and always looking over their shoulder to make sure that everybody likes them, including people who hate them.
Glenn, go ahead.
On a different level, I think we may be seeing the breakdown of that entire system because of all the stuff going on at Harvard. Mm-hmm. They haven't gotten as much publicity, but there's been one serious plagiarism scandal after another, starting with the president and working its way down. Mm-hmm. I think that's may have the long-term effect of really tarnishing the reputation of these elite institutions. The question then is what reapices them?
Yeah.
Because
it's kind of like the Midianites killing them.
Have something to establish that kind of elite. It's just a fact of life. Yeah. So if it isn't going to be Harvard, who is it?
Yeah, the Midianites are killing each other, and that's entertaining. But you're right.
You should let them do it.
That's right. We should let them do it. But at some point, you're right. How do we care less about what U.S. News and World Reports does in terms of our ranking?
Well, exactly what I was going to say. That part of this, I mean, we hope that these institutions that are not worth a dime do destroy themselves. I mean, the best thing is to let them. I'm not as now. Glenn's beard is grayer and longer, so he's wiser than me. But I am not as optimistic about Harvard in this way. I'm not actually sure what will happen. What could happen to destroy it, essentially, by which I mean, let's keep the buildings. I like a lot of those, but its cachet is gone because you see this. I mean, this again is something what I'm talking about, how the left operates and we don't. Claudine is her first name, Gay, right? Plagiarism scandal. What happens to her? She keeps her salary, $900,000 a year, and now she just gets to teach. I mean, this is like a dream gig. Now she has no responsibility whatsoever, basically has tenure. They don't kick her to the curb, and someone just like her replaces her, right? So the left does not worry about this stuff. They take care of their people. Sometimes you're exiled performatively for a little bit, and then you read the back pages of the newspaper, and you're like, oh, they're back. So the point is they take care of their own people, and they don't take they take their real work seriously. They don't take the actual outrage or violations of some kind of norms that they commit all the time seriously at all. Anyway, this happens at scale, across all institutions, but it's focusing on the school aspect. So we need to think in a sort of more protectionist sense, I would say. But to go into what Chris was talking about too, how do you displace these people. Let's say they're not going to destroy themselves, but they can be displaced. You have to completely buck and disregard the pre-existing status hierarchy. And you have to say, I don't care about U.S. news. These are, and this starts with parents, and this starts with employers that are Christians. And you have to say, I don't care about any of that. What I care about is the quality, in the way I think of quality education as a Christian, as a proponent of Western civilization in America. And I think these are all different metrics. I think of the purveyance of the faith, of all these things, but also I think of institutions that are going to produce the leadership that we need, not just to get the bottom dollar, this sort of just how much money, $250K with a white picket fence, whatever. Not just that, but like real elites in leadership in the sense that we want them. And that's what you pursue. And if you can never pursue that so long as you're beholden to the pre-existing arrangement.
All right.
Yeah.
All right.
I should note that I'm speculating about Harvard. I'm thinking mostly in terms of their reputation, though, within the general public. I have a feeling that the stories are going to get buried and they're going to forget, but one can always hope.
I hope that is the case. The other aspect that gives me pause on that is, if there's one predominant ethic right now, the worst thing you can be in America is a racist, right? Absolute worst thing. There's nothing worse. Harvard is demonstrably racist for a long time. Like, this is not even new. I mean, this is basically the entire 20th century extended to today, and nothing happens to them. No one cares. Everyone would still send their kid to Harvard because it is a gateway into the class they want to be in. And so it doesn't matter what's going on there. So my only point, Glenn, is not that they're not doing terrible things that are disgraceful and worthy of of losing their status, but just that it's such a stranglehold and it suits, the interest of those people, that it's really not about the education, the quality or whatever. It's about getting to, Davos one day or something, whatever they want to do. And that pipeline is so secure still. It's not that we don't all hate those people in the pipeline and they hate us, but it's hard to figure out how do you do. And so my only alternative that I can think of is we just have to play the same game in our own way and just ignore them in some sense. Don't try to be Harvard, the evangelical Harvard. What a cop out. What mimicking, the people that you're doomed to fail from the beginning. You say we're going to do, our thing. We're going to be better. At least that's the theory. We're all speculating.
Brandeis University was founded in the late 1940s by the secular Jewish community who were fed up with quotas for Jews at Harvard.
Yeah.
Their curriculum was designed by Albert Einstein.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we can kind of go on and on. I mean, but they end up being a school ideologically very much like what you see at Harvard.
Yeah, yes. You can't tell much difference. Right?
Well, and that's I mean, they did it because Jews were being discriminated against, quota system, whatever, but they wanted to be there, right? So they said, well, we'll do the thing. The Catholics do the same thing. Notre Dame is, their Ivy League because they couldn't get into the other ones. And so there is a sense in which we're doing that, but they were still in a roundabout way playing the game to get into the status hierarchy as it goes all the way to the top. What we're saying is we're going to have to, in some senses, start from scratch, but revive a mentality for leadership and control over the country that it is still statistically even ours, even at this late date, which is pretty encouraging that people are still. I mean, I actually can't believe it. Historically, it's ours. It's a Protestant country. Leadership was abdicated by the main line in the 60s. Finally, I mean, it was rotting for a long time. And so we need to take ownership is I guess the best way I'd put it over these things. That's my kind of vision for what we can do at various institutional levels that we do still have, say over and try to use them in that way.
So let's look at the evolution of the evangelical world.
Mm-hmm.
The evangelicals started off having, I think it was 4 characteristics that have been identified. Conversionist, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Bibliocentric, obviously. Crucicentric, obviously. Social action.
Mm-hmm.
Really? Yeah, the early evangelicals were known for that. They believed that you had to put your faith into practice in public life. somehow, I think probably because of the Second Great Awakening. Well, no, even in the Second Great Awakening, you had a strong social action thing. Somewhere along the way, the conversionism side of things took over and the social action dropped out.
Well, I would modify
Once that happened, you get this idea that the faith is about what you do at church. It's not what you do in politics.
Well, I would modify that a little bit, Glenn. Timothy Smith, the author of Revivalism and Social Reform, obviously kind of the Wesleyan holiness tradition, he taught it. What's the school in? Johns Hopkins. But anyways, it was all liberationist in character. In other words, the kind of social action we're talking about didn't see itself as, sort of giving a sort of, or trying to reinforce, given ends, or trying to direct, say, various institutions to the glory of God, like law or whatever. It was more or less, well, it was the temperance movement. It was
the temperance movement. It was the abolitionist movement. It's the movement against prostitution. It's a whole host of things like
also
that.
very, very much, the women's movement. Kind of the early phases of that. So many of the institutions, many of the denominations that were associated with that social, sort of social revivalism and social reform, became egalitarian in their understanding of the relationship between men and women.
Yeah. Another aspect of the. Sorry, Tom. Go ahead.
I was going to say that's where you're starting to really see the results of a gutted doctrine of creation, created order, ends, purposes, teleology, moving towards just eschatology, really towards a kind of almost a Gnostic vision of eschatology.
Another aspect of the way, evangelicalism, as we're talking about it, even coinciding with the neo-evangelicalism, whether it's a new thing or not, I'm not sure, but that was another adjustment, phase to try to make it more palatable to mainstream. But there's always been the recognition, of course, and it's still the case today, and this is still why certain people act a certain way, that evangelicals are a very significant and important voting bloc, right? They do things, and so you saw during, even in the early years of the Cold War, massive corporate interest and exertion into steering evangelicals towards, certainly against communism, but it just so happened it was always in this sort of overreactive individualist and radically libertarian vein that they pushed evangelicals towards. And that was concerted effort, tons of money to do that. And you saw it continue all the way through, I guess up to today, through the Koch brothers and everyone else, right? They target these groups, and it's to be Christian is to be, against the atheism and the communism, which means, and now, Marxism, neo-Marxism, whatever, which means to be the polar opposite in a radical sense, purely individual. And that, of course, in capitalism is Christian. I mean, they had those slogans coming out of whatever the first Congregational Church in Los Angeles was. I mean, that mission, group and this, whatever their publications were, I can't remember. Anyway, point is, all that was a concerted effort to make evangelicals think a certain way, and that's still, the legacy is still there. And a lot of that, underneath it, most of those people were theologically liberal, actually, in terms of their biblical fidelity and rootedness in any kind of tradition, even as they were libertarian publicly. Actually, that all makes sense to me, but it seems like a contradiction to many authors. But it suited corporate and financial interest, and it was very effective, and it still works that way. So I think evangelicals need to also see themselves as developing defenses against being used because they are still significant. But all that stuff swirling around, I mean, it's so hard to put the genie back in the bottle, or rather, exorcise some of these demons in the evangelical brains. So.
It's very interesting what you said in terms of, because I think that's one of the big issues and problems, is this relatedness and adoption of a kind of modernist notion of libertarian will and self that has been embraced by evangelicals that is no different than the general culture's conception of it. It just happens that maybe have a Christian gloss on it in some way.
Right.
And the corporate manipulation and direction of it. It's interesting. I was reading a 2004 article by Paul Griffiths, the Catholic thinker who wrote Intellect and Appetite. And he was looking at the way that some of the classic kind of 60s radicals like Terry Eagleton, the famous critical theorist in Marxist, and then looking at more contemporary kind of neo-Marxists like Zizek, how they were disturbed that the critical theoretical agenda had been hijacked by the corporate world in the U.S. and basically had become a consumerist radical libertarian vision, that they were turning to classic Christian doctrinal sources to have a better kind of moral Marxism. It's stunning.
That's good. So what you're talking about is sort of like the Ben and Jerry effect on politics. In other words, here you got a bunch of crunchies who are millionaires and millionaire commies or whatever.
That's right. Yeah. No, that's very interesting. I mean, I think look, there's much about that's ingrained in the American way of life that is different than any European country would ever be. But so much of that is not actually, at least in its original form, the way people conceive of it now. And a lot of this has been really poor, not just theological, but historical education. Again, concerted efforts to sort of catechize people in a certain way. And what you come down to, I mean, these same people, Koch brothers, whatever, they may claim that they're against open borders, unchecked immigration, whatever. But what you've done is turned everyone into an economic unit who lives in an economic zone. So now how do you do border security with a people that conceives of themselves as these sort of economic mechanisms running around, availing themselves of every choice? It's just unworkable. So these things, I can't convince everybody about this, but they do matter, how you think about yourself.
Yeah, as opposed to a human being and a citizen and that kind of,
with an eternal destiny, right?
So let me throw something out to you here, because I'm in a very odd situation. I'm here in the Pacific Northwest, and the dominant Christian presence here is evangelical. We have no mainline presence to speak of in Battleground. A couple of little, we got a little Methodist church, a little Lutheran church. They're dwarfed by the 1,000-member Russian Baptist church, that kind of thing. And we've got almost no Roman Catholic presence, almost no Orthodox presence, even in spite of the fact that we've got this very large Slavic population. There's almost no Orthodox presence. They're all evangelicals. And we've got two groups, the Apostolic Lutherans, which are Laplanders. They're not, they're even in Scandinavia, they're considered kind of weird. but in terms of their presence here, they're very strong. They've got 30, 40,000 in the area, and very, Christian in terms of their moral family life, conduct, and that kind of thing. And then we got the Russians and the Ukrainians, who are all Baptists and Pentecostals, but they're used to, being sent off to the gulags. So both groups, because one's pietistic and the other's got a history of actually, some significant persecution, are shy about getting involved. But then there are even the sort of the more mainstream evangelical big Eva types. We've got a number of those churches, like I said, of about 1,000 members or more. And yet, we don't have, say, a public presence. Now, we've got an ethos. Battleground has a very, I think, Christian ethos. And everybody in the area knows, you don't do the gay rights thing over there, nobody shows up, that kind of thing. Nevertheless, everybody's a little bit reticent. And I think that maybe one of the roles that our particular church can play is a public role, kind of speaking for these folks. Have you had any kind of time to reflect on, sort of maybe more broadly, how those of us who are thinking about these things can maybe be really kind of the the patricians who are serving the larger evangelical world, who maybe because of their theological heritage or whatever are reticent to get involved.
That's very, I mean, that is, you're right. It's a very odd scenario you have up there that I'm not sure I've ever heard that makeup in one location. Yes, what is good, though, is you have no threat of evangelicals who get really into, the church fathers or something, swimming the Tiber or becoming Eastern Orthodox, which is like what everybody does now, as they're not around. But yes, so the idea that those churches, or maybe even individuals that are ready, willing, and able to speak on behalf of we could say the Protestant or Christian interest in the country, can and should. I think that's definitely the case. I mean, I would endorse that wholeheartedly. I tend to. In my political nirvana, there would be more of an establishment feel. I like order and chain of command and synods and things like this. But in the interim, where we don't have as much of that at a political level, where it actually matters in this sense, I think it's incumbent on people to perform that role as best they can, especially if people are willing for you to do it and will back you, doing it, even if they can't themselves, as a sort of spokesman for communities, that form together. And I think the general attitude in America itself is especially pan-Protestant. We've pretty broadly conceived, actually, but the idea that Baptists and Presbyterians and Congregationalists are basically accepting of one another and can kind of operate well together, especially as political blocs. I think that's a good thing that should be recovered as much as possible for these purposes.
Well, we're getting near the point where we're going to wrap things up, and I know there are lots of things probably swirling in Glenn and Tom's minds. So let's go to you guys. Glenn, do you have anything you want to state or ask at this point?
There are, I'm just sort of ticking through my stuff on, from Slaying Leviathan and from all of these other directions, and I'm afraid any of them would take us way too far afield and take way too long to go through, so I'll pass.
Okay. Tom, how about you?
I think, I think paralleling all the work that you're doing is what we are doing and trying to do, both with the podcast in its own way, but also the work we do. I mean, I similarly am trying a lot of the retrieval work of some of the rich things in ethics, virtue formation, classic Christian understandings of these things, which are so rich and are so immense that when I present them, even at seminary, students have no clue what to do with it. Evangelical students who've grown in the church, been to seminary 2 or 3 years, they don't realize that this is even Christian. And this is with evangelicals and Protestants at large. And so I think we have a lot of the value commitments they have been so shaped by the surrounding culture and its loves that bringing Christian richness back in is a huge task. And so I guess the question is, I think from what I'm hearing is just start where you are and get rolling with it. Not so much, it's from there that we actually get things out. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, I would. There's a lot there that we could. You basically just did what Glenn said he wouldn't do. We can't work, but
I ran with his point.
No, this is great. I'll try to keep it brief. My thoughts in return. That is what I'm saying. Start. People need to start where they are. I was. Railing in a certain sense against the capitalist in kind of the way Marx would refer to them. At the same time, Americans have always been industrious people. That's part of our culture and ethos and history. I think that's venerable, and I think we should do it again. And we've been especially, this is up through, the kind of the Gilded Age, for better or worse, socially industrious. That's where you get all these societies doing things, maybe it was a little disjointed and could have been better organized, but the amount of activity and money dedicated to these things, time, all that. This is a very American thing. And so I think we've lost some of that drive. Most of our big institutions that get all the money and time and resources in evangelicalism are a waste of time. They're not doing anything that they should, other than assuring the kind of the elites as they stand, or the regime, or whatever you want to call it, that we're okay. We're acting like we're in this embattled first century position, which is what they want you to think. It's not the first century. Don't act like it's the first century. So I think starting where you are is excellent advice, and people should become active again, and sort of spend themselves on these things, because God's charged us with it in this providence. Last thing I'll say is just on the resourcement. I mean, I am big on the education side, because maybe some people think it's cliche, and they want to get going on some things, which I do too. But I don't think we can underestimate how detrimental a lack of true education has been. And I'm meaning in the tradition for, takes a long time to build up that sort of stockpile of learning, and like no time to lose it. When I went to Westminster, we were the last class that used Machen's Greek textbook, because it has too much Latin in it, and no one coming to school now knows Latin, even in grad school. And Machen could not have conceived of the fact that if you're studying Koine Greek, you don't know Latin already. Even that, you're just like, we're lesser mortals. I'm somewhat sentimental about the 18th century generations. I think they were incredibly socially and educationally virtuous people, and they were intentional about that. You can see that from the reading levels, all this stuff. Roman and Greek antiquity was not window dressing to them, and neither was Scripture. I mean, they lived in these worlds. If you read John Adams, that's obvious, right? So anyone else. So my point is, like, we're just not quite actually prepared to take on the task that those people could have. It's not presented itself yet to us, but as we work towards hopefully having opportunities like that for the good of our country, we got to prepare ourselves along the way, and that's a tall order.
Yeah. Well, this has been a great conversation, Timon. Now, of course, everyone in Pugcast land needs to look up American Reformer and follow it. But is there anything else that you want us to make certain that people know about and avail themselves of?
No, follow American Reformer. That's where most. I mean, I write at World somewhat frequently now. American Mind as well sometimes, but most of it's at American Reformer, and mainly so you can read all the other great people that write for us. We really do have we're building a pretty good roster of people. It's broadly Protestant, so you also have, we've published charismatic, LCMS, all kinds of people to try to really recover that sensibility of a general Protestantism in America. But it also shows you parallel issues across denominations that are happening. Everyone is kind of in the same boat. And so it's good to read those. So I just encourage everybody to read all the those people that write for us. There's always good stuff. I'm always impressed by what we receive, including even sometimes C.R. Wiley writes for us.
That's right. I haven't besmirched the publication yet.
Not yet.
Yeah. Anyway, this is great. Thanks a lot, Timon. And thank you for listening to the Theology Pugcast. You've gotten all the way to the end of an episode. And as your reward, you get to hear about Patreon. We really do depend on people who on a monthly basis support us. And we're really grateful for those folks. And if you'd like to become one of them, you can follow the link in the show notes to the Patreon page and do that. The other thing is we're getting ready for our trip to Oxford. I'm in the middle of pulling some things together for our Indiegogo campaign. There are some things that we're going to need to cover. Our expenses are paid in terms of the trip and our stay there, and even our transportation in the country. Everything is set, but there are some things that we're going to need to pay for when it comes to the production of our documentary and some of the shows and so forth. So that'll be up pretty soon. Probably won't be up in time for this show's show notes, but be on the lookout for that. All right. Well, thanks a lot, and bye-bye.
Bye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. To learn more about the church, you can visit trinityreformedkirk.com. trinityreformedkirk.com.